Raymond Calloway had a system for Tuesdays. He woke at 5:30, not because an alarm told him to, but because 40 years of discipline had rewired something deep inside him that could not be undone by retirement papers or a bad knee. He made coffee, black, no sugar, and drank it, standing at the kitchen window, while the neighborhood slowly remembered it was alive. He watched a dog walker, a mail truck, a woman in scrubs rushing to her car. Then he rinsed his cup, put on his plain olive jacket, and drove to wherever Tuesday required him to be. This particular Tuesday, it was the Veterans Affairs Medical Center on the west side of the city. A routine appointment, blood pressure check, prescription refill, the usual quiet transaction of a body that had been used hard and was now being maintained like an old piece of machinery that still mostly worked. He pulled into the parking lot at 8:47, sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off, the way he always did, not from hesitation, but from habit, old habits, the kind that kept you alive when hesitation was the difference between coming home and not. His truck was a 2003 Ford F-150, dark green, no bumper stickers, no military plates. No decals of eagles or flags or unit insignia. The back window was clean. The cab was clean. Raymond Calloway had spent the better part of 3 decades making sure nothing about him drew unnecessary attention, and that practice had followed him into civilian life the way a shadow follows a man, attached, automatic, and invisible to him now. He was 67 years old. His hair had gone fully white somewhere in his late 50s, and his face had the kind of deep lines that come not from age alone, but from years of squinting into darkness, into instruments, into the kind of focus that leaves its marks permanently. He walked with a slight hitch in his left knee, the result of a hard landing in a training exercise in 1998 that he had never fully reported, because there had been no time to report it, and then later no point. The knee reminded him of itself every morning, and he acknowledged it the way you acknowledge an old argument you have both agreed to stop having. Inside the medical center, the waiting area was doing what waiting areas do: fluorescent lights, plastic chairs in rows, a television mounted high on the wall playing a morning news program with the sound too low to follow, a water cooler, a bulletin board covered in flyers for programs nobody read, the smell of industrial cleaning solution underneath everything, like a constant apology. Near the entrance, a folding table had been set up with pamphlets and a standing banner. A community outreach initiative. Raymond had seen the notice in his appointment confirmation email and paid it no attention. Behind the table sat a young soldier in service uniform. He was perhaps 22, maybe younger, with the kind of posture that was still self-conscious about being correct. He was watching the door with the alertness of someone who had been told to be alert and was taking the instructions seriously. His name tag read, Mounts. Raymond walked past the table without stopping. Mounts looked up, offered a polite nod the way you nod at anyone, and looked back at the door. Raymond took a number from the dispenser, 44, and found an empty chair near the window. He set his jacket across his knees and waited. He was good at waiting. It was perhaps the skill he had refined more than any other in his life. Waiting in the dark above a landing zone, with your rotors at flight idle, and your instruments saying everything is fine, while every other signal in the universe says it is not. That teaches a man about waiting in a way that nothing else can. He had been sitting for perhaps 12 minutes when the door to the corridor opened, and a woman came through with a clipboard. She was in her mid-30s, compact and precise in her movements, wearing the lanyard and ID badge of a patient liaison. Her hair was pulled back. Her expression was professionally neutral in the way that certain people learn to carry themselves. People who have spent time in environments where emotion, unless carefully chosen, creates problems. She scanned the room, not casually, specifically, the way you scan a room when you are looking for a particular thing and you know approximately what it looks like. Her eyes found Raymond Calloway. She crossed the waiting room. She did not weave between the chairs or navigate around the other occupants the way most people do, slightly apologetically, slightly small. She walked directly, with the kind of quiet authority that does not announce itself. She stopped in front of him. Raymond looked up. She straightened. Her feet came together. Her right hand came up, clean and deliberate, to the edge of her brow, a full military salute, crisp enough and precise enough that it would have passed inspection on any parade ground, in any branch of the armed forces. She held it. 1 beat. 2. The television murmured. Someone coughed on the other side of the room. A form rustled. Raymond's face, which had been doing what his face always did, which was nothing, which was the neutral expression of a man who had spent decades making sure his face communicated as little as possible, shifted. Not dramatically, but the way a still lake surface shifts when something moves beneath it. A small change that meant something large. He looked at her for a long moment. "Why salute me?" he asked. His voice was quiet. Not suspicious, not dismissive, genuinely confused, with something underneath the confusion that was harder to name, something that had not been touched in a long time and was not quite sure how to respond to being touched. She lowered her hand. She leaned forward just slightly, and she said it clearly, without drama, without performance, without looking around to see who was listening. Only night stalkers earn that kind of respect ever. The room kept moving. Forms kept being filled. The television kept murmuring. But across the waiting area, Specialist Derek Mounts, 22 years old and exactly 93 days into his active duty Army career, went completely still. Her name was Alicia Fenwick. She had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the 10th Mountain Division and come home in one piece physically, which she considered a form of grace she had not entirely earned. She worked now at the VA because it was the only job she had found after leaving service that made her feel like she was still doing something that mattered. Part of her work involved reviewing intake files. Not deeply, not medical details, those were protected, but names, service history summaries, branch, unit, years served. She reviewed them the way a librarian reviews a card catalog, looking for things that needed special handling. 3 weeks earlier, the name Raymond Calloway had appeared in her system for a Tuesday appointment. Beneath his name, in the unit field, were 4 numbers and a 3-letter designation that she recognized immediately, because her father had spoken those numbers and those letters to her once, when she was 19 years old and newly enlisted and full of the kind of confidence that has not yet been tested by anything real. Her father had been Army too, infantry. He had never served with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, but he had served near them once, briefly, in a context he was not specific about, and what he told her was this: "Those men fly into places that do not exist on any map you will ever be allowed to read. They fly in the dark, at altitudes that should not be possible, in conditions that would ground every other aircraft in the inventory. They do not miss. They do not quit. They do not tell you what they have done, and they never will. And that silence is not cowardice. It is the job. If you ever meet one, Alicia, you remember what they gave, because they cannot tell you themselves." She had been carrying that for 15 years. When she saw Raymond Calloway's name in the intake system, she had looked at his file for a long time. Then she had decided something, quietly and completely, the way she made most of her decisions. Now she stood in front of him in a waiting room that smelled of cleaning solution, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not fully read, but recognized as something between disbelief and a grief she did not have a word for. "Your father served," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "What branch?" "Infantry. He never served with your unit, but he knew what it was." Raymond nodded, slowly. He looked at his hands for a moment, which were resting flat on his jacket across his knees, and then he looked back up at her. "He told you." "Enough," she said. "He told me enough." There was a pause between them that was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of pause that exists between people who are speaking a language that does not require every word to be said out loud. "Thank him for me," Raymond said. "He passed in 2021, she said, "but I will." She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she nodded once, the way you nod when something is finished and complete, and she moved on with her clipboard to the business of the day. Raymond sat with the silence she had left behind. He had flown his first operational mission in 1986. He had flown his last in 2004. In between those years, he had put helicopters into places that did not want them, extracted people from situations that should not have been survivable, and done it all in the dark, always in the dark, because darkness was the element the 160th SOAR owned as completely as fish own water. He had received commendations that lived in classified files in a building in Virginia. He had shaken hands with generals whose names he could not repeat in public. He had attended the funerals of men whose deaths were reported in newspapers as training accidents. He had come home each time to a house, and then to a quieter house, and then eventually to a house where he lived alone, because the life he had lived did not translate easily into the kind of partnership that required presence and availability, and the ability to explain where you had been. He had never regretted the choice. He had chosen it with full understanding, the way all night stalkers chose it, not because they had to, but because they were the particular kind of person who could look at what the mission cost and decide that the mission was worth it. That was what made them what they were. Not skill alone, not courage alone, the willingness to pay the full price and never ask for the receipt. But sometimes, in the very still part of the night, Raymond Calloway would lie in his plain house, in his plain bed, and feel the specific weight of being unknown. Not lonely exactly, not regretful, just the particular heaviness of a life fully lived in invisibility. He had not known, until this Tuesday morning in a waiting room, how much he had needed someone to see it. Across the room, Specialist Derek Mounts was experiencing something he did not have the vocabulary for yet. He had heard the exchange, not all of it, just enough. He had caught the word she whispered. He had seen the salute she rendered to a man in a plain jacket, sitting in a plastic chair like everyone else. And something had shifted in his understanding of the institution he had joined. A small but significant shift, like a door that had always been there revealing itself for the first time. He left his table, he walked across the waiting room, not quickly, and stopped in front of Raymond Calloway. He was nervous in a way that he recognized as different from other kinds of nervousness. This was not the nervousness of a test or a physical challenge. This was the nervousness of being in the presence of something real. He brought his hand up to a salute. Slow, deliberate, uncertain in its mechanics, but certain in its intention. Raymond looked at him for a long moment. The young soldier's face was serious and open. Not performing seriousness, actually serious. Which in Raymond's experience was not as common as it should have been in someone that age. He stood. The bad knee protested quietly. He straightened to his full height, which was still considerable, and he returned the salute. Clean. Complete. The salute of a man who had rendered it 10,000 times and never once done it carelessly. He held it for a beat longer than required. Then he lowered it. "Thank you for your service, sir," Mounts said. The sentence came out smaller than he had intended it, because he understood as he was saying it that it was not large enough for what he meant, but it was what he had. Raymond looked at him. Something passed across the old man's face, not quite a smile, not quite not one. "Pay attention," he said. "Every room you walk into, pay attention to who else is in it." Mounts nodded. "Yes, sir." Raymond picked up his jacket from the chair and settled it over his arm. "And thank whoever told you to look." Then he walked to the window and stood there quietly, waiting for his number to be called, looking out at the parking lot where his plain truck sat in the morning light. Mounts went back to his table. He sat down. He looked at the door for a while without seeing it. That evening, after his shift ended, and he had driven back to the barracks and changed out of his uniform and eaten whatever the dining facility had to offer, he sat on the edge of his bunk with his phone and searched the words he had heard in a waiting room. One hero will rise against the odds to face the ultimate challenge. He read for a long time. He read about the unit's founding after Operation Eagle Claw. He read about the training pipeline that washed out more people than it kept. He read about missions in places he had never heard of, described only in the vaguest terms because even now, decades later, the details belonged to a category of information that the public was not cleared to hold. He read the motto, "Night Stalkers Don't Quit," and understood for the first time that a motto could be a biography. He did not sleep well that night, but it was the good kind of not sleeping, the kind that means something has grown larger inside you and your mind is still measuring the new dimensions. Alicia Fenwick drove home with the window down, even though the evening was cool. She thought about her father. She thought about a photograph she had found in his things after he passed, him and 3 other soldiers, somewhere desert-colored, squinting into a sun she could not place. On the back, in his handwriting, were 4 words. These men were real. She thought she understood now what he meant by that. Not that other soldiers were somehow less, but that certain people chose a particular quality of realness, paid for it in ways that left no visible marks, and then carried it quietly through the rest of their lives, past the recognition and the parades and the public understanding, into plain trucks and Tuesday appointments and waiting rooms where nobody knew their names. She pulled into her driveway and sat for a moment with the engine off. She felt, without being able to fully explain why, that her father would have approved of today, that in some small way she had delivered something on his behalf that had been waiting a long time to arrive. Inside his house, Raymond Calloway set his keys on the kitchen counter and stood at the window with another cup of black coffee while the neighborhood settled into evening. He watched the lights come on in the houses around him. He watched the dog walker from the morning make the return trip. He watched the ordinary beautiful machinery of a neighborhood doing what neighborhoods do when the day is ending. The silence in the kitchen was the same silence it had always been. But tonight, for a reason he could not fully name, and did not try to, it felt different. Not louder, not filled with anything it had not contained before, just lighter, somehow, as though it had been carrying something for a long time, and had, in some small and improbable way, been allowed to set a little of it down. He finished his coffee. He rinsed the cup. He turned off the kitchen light. Outside, the city went on being a city, and somewhere in it, 3 people carried something from a Tuesday morning that none of them would forget, and none of them would entirely be able to explain, and all of them, in their own quiet way, were grateful for.